The Battle of Hamel was a successful attack launched by the Australian Corps of the Australian Imperial Force and several American units against German positions in and around the town of Le Hamel in northern France during World War I. The battle was planned and commanded by Lieutenant General John Monash. Many of the tactics employed, such as the use of combined arms from the massed attacks mounted earlier in the war, illustrate the evolution of modern military tactics. All the Allies' objectives were achieved in 93 minutes, just 3 minutes more than Monash's calculated battle time of 90 minutes. Using conventional tactics, the fighting could have lasted for weeks or months, with much higher casualty rates. For example, a similar defensive position had resisted Allied capture for 2 months at the Battle of the Somme. The battle was the first time in the war that American troops participated in an offensive action under non-American command. 10 American companies joined with Australian troops under Australian command, although 6 were recalled before the battle. Background: military situation in early 1918. As a result of the capitulation of Russia, the Germans began concentrating the bulk of their forces on the Western Front. Over the space of 4 months, up to 48 divisions were moved to the west, concentrating their efforts on the Somme Valley. The Germans launched a major offensive, the Spring Offensive, against the British southern flank on the 21st of March. After pushing the Allies back towards the railhead at Amiens, the German advance in the sector was checked around Villers-Bretonneux in early April. As the German offensive exhausted itself, in June the Allies began to prepare for their own offensive, conducting a series of small-scale advances which became known as peace penetrations. After the initial application of this technique around Maulincourt, the commander of the British Fourth Army, Lieutenant General Henry Rawlinson, decided that the next strike would come at the village of Le Hamel, Somme. The German advance earlier in the year had created a bulge in the front line around the village, which had created a salient that exposed Allied troops in the sector to enfilading fire and enabled the Germans to observe Allied rear areas. Capturing the village would help set an aggressive posture and relieve pressure in the sector. Lieutenant General John Monash, commander of the Australian Corps, was chosen to plan the attack. Geography: located south of the River Somme, about 1.9 miles northwest of Villers-Bretonneux on a spur between 2 hills, Hamel was strategically important to both the Allies and Germans. The high ground offered the Germans good observation of the sector, which they had been using to fire artillery barrages on Villers-Bretonneux, and control of the village was vital if they wished to continue their offensive in the sector, and would enable them to continue to threaten Amiens, 11 miles distant. The Allied line was positioned on the reverse slope of a hill 1.5 miles to the west of the village, and securing the village would enable the Allies to stiffen their defensive line. The village also acted as an obstacle to the proposed eastward advance through the Somme planned for later in the year, and its capture would facilitate future offensive operations in the sector. Prelude: planning the Allied victory owed much to Monash's detailed planning and to the briefing of all the troops on their objectives. The battle was his first as commander of the Australian Corps. The Allies made novel use of a number of tactics, such as parachute drops of medical supplies and rifle ammunition in cases, and resupply by tank rather than by troops carrying supplies forward. The supply tanks and aircraft brought stores quickly to the troops as they advanced. The carrying power of the tanks equated to about 1,200 troops doing the same job. Signals were sent largely by cable and telephone, but new methods of signaling were also trialed, including the use of rockets, which were used by some battalion headquarters to pass urgent messages to the rear, although this proved largely ineffective. Other techniques were more effective, such as the use of pigeons, Lucas lamps, and for the first time, wirelesses were used by officers to send messages from captured objectives. There was advanced coordination between infantry, artillery and armor, and the latest highly maneuverable Mark V tank was used after it had been demonstrated to Monash and Rawlinson. 5 companies of the British 5th Tank Brigade were provided for the assault. Although the Australians had worked with a small number of tanks successfully at Villers-Bretonneux, their opinion of the technology was clouded by the bad experience they had had of them in April and May 1917 around Bullecourt. As such, to ensure coordination and overcome the problems the Australians had experienced at Bullecourt, the Australian infantry and tanks trained and lived together prior to the battle. Colour diagrams were painted on the sides of the tanks, corresponding to the battalions that they would support, so that the infantry knew which tank to follow. The battle plan called for a creeping barrage, in which the artillery barrage moved slowly in front of the advancing troops. This protected the troops by suppressing enemy activity, thereby easing their advance. Over 600 British and French guns, 302 heavy and 326 field pieces, were used for the barrage and counter-battery fire, including regular barrages in the days leading up to the attack. Monash was adamant that the infantry should not be sacrificed in an unprotected advance, hence his care to ensure that they were well covered. Prior to the attack, the artillery spent 2 weeks conducting conditioning firing in the sector, firing gas and smoke shells at the same time every day before dawn, while strict operational security procedures were implemented. In addition, 46 heavy machine guns were placed in area support, while the number of Lewis guns was increased to provide organic fire support. Assaulting forces identifying the German defenders as the 13th Infantry Division, consisting of the 13th, 35th and 58th Regiments, and estimating their strength as being 2,790, with 2,860 in reserve. Monash chose Major General Ewan Sinclair McLagan's Australian 4th Division to provide the bulk of the assaulting force, consisting of 3 depleted brigades, the 4th, 12th and 13th. It was reinforced by 2 brigades that were detached from other divisions, the 6th from the 2nd Division and the 11th from the 3rd Division. To avoid depleting the 4th Division too much, Monash determined that only the 4th Brigade would take part in the assault, along with the 2 reinforcing brigades, while a 4th Brigade, the 15th, from the 5th Division, was assigned a diversionary role to north of the River Somme, launching a feint against Ville-sur-Ancre, conceived as an opportunity to employ a combined arms approach. Brigadier General Anthony Courage's British 5th Tank Brigade, equipped with the new Mark V tank, was assigned to support the attack, along with large quantities of aircraft and artillery. Rawlinson suggested to Monash in late June 1918 that American involvement in a set-piece attack alongside the Australians would give the American troops experience and strengthen the Australian battalions, which had been weakened by heavy casualties and falling recruitment, by an additional company each. On 29 June, Major General George Bell, commanding the American 33rd Division, selected 2 companies, each of 250 men, from the 131st and 132nd Infantry Regiments of the 65th Brigade. Nevertheless, Monash had been promised 10 American companies, and on 30 June the remaining companies of the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 131st Infantry Regiment were sent. Each American platoon was attached to an Australian company. A difficulty in integrating the 60-man American platoons into the 100-strong Australian companies was overcome by reducing the size of each American platoon by 1/5 and sending the removed troops, which numbered 50 officers and men, back to battalion reinforcement camps. The commitment of these companies represented the first time in history that U.S. troops would fight under a foreign commander. The Australian Prime Minister, Billy Hughes, addressed the troops on the 2nd of July, 2 days before the attack was scheduled to commence. The next morning, General John J. Pershing, the commander of the American Expeditionary Force in France, learnt of the plan and ordered the withdrawal of 6 American companies. While a few Americans, such as those attached to the 42nd Battalion, disobeyed the order, the majority, although disappointed, moved back to the rear. This meant that battalions had to rearrange their attack formations and caused a serious reduction in the size of the Allied force. For example, the 11th Brigade was now attacking with 2,200 men instead of 3,000. There was a further last-minute call for the removal of all American troops from the attack, but Monash, who had chosen the 4th of July as the date of the attack out of deference to the U.S. troops, protested to Rawlinson and received support from Field Marshal Douglas Haig, commander of the British Expeditionary Force. In total, the Allied assault force totaled around 7,000 men.